Chapter 7. A common thief! Schomberg bit his tongue just too late, and woke up completely as he saw Ricardo retract his lips in a cat-like grin. But the companion of plain Mr. Jones didn't alter his comfortable gossiping attitude. Gone. What if he did want to see his money back, like any tame shopkeeper, ash-seller, gin-slinger or ink-spewer does? Fancy a mud turtle like you trying to pass an opinion on a gentleman. A gentleman isn't to be sized up so easily. Even I ain't up to it sometimes. For instance, that night, all he did was to waggle his finger at me. The skipper stops his silly chatter, surprised. Hey, what's the matter, says he. The matter? It was his reprieve. That's what was the matter. Oh, nothing, says my gentleman. You are perfectly right. A log. Nothing but a log. Ha ha. Reprieve, I call it, because if the skipper had gone on with his silly argument much longer, he would have had to be knocked out of the way. I could hardly hold myself in on account of the precious minutes. However, his guardian angel put it into his head to shut up and go back to his bed. I was ramping mad about the lost time. Why didn't you let me give him one on his silly coconut, sir? I asks. No ferocity, he says, raising his finger at me calm as you please. You can't tell how a gentleman takes that sort of thing. They don't lose their temper. It's bad form. You'll never see him lose his temper. Not for anybody to see, anyhow. Ferocity ain't good form either. That much I've learnt by this time, and more too. I've had that schooling that you couldn't tell by my face if I meant to rip you up the next minute, as of course I could do in less than a jiffy. I've a knife up the leg of my trousers. You haven't, exclaimed Schomberg incredulously. Mr. Ricardo was as quick as lightning in changing his lounging, idle attitude for a stooping position, and exhibiting the weapon with one jerk of the left leg of his trousers. Schomberg had just a view of it, strapped to a very hairy limb, when Mr. Ricardo, jumping up, stamped his foot to get the trouser leg down, and resumed his careless pose with one elbow on the table. It's a more handy way to carry a tool than you would think, he went on, gazing abstractedly into Schomberg's wide-open eyes. Suppose some little difference comes up during a game. Well, you stoop to pick up a dropped card, and when you come up, there you are, ready to strike. Or with the thing up your sleeve ready to throw. Or you just dodge under the table when there's some shooting coming. You believe the damage a fellow with a knife under the table can do to ill-conditioned skunks that want to raise trouble before they begin to understand what the screaming's about and make a bolt. Those that can, that is. The roses of Schomberg's cheek at the root of his chestnut beard faded perceptibly. Ricardo chuckled faintly. But no ferocity. A gentleman knows. What's the good of getting yourself into a state? And no shirking necessity either. No gentleman ever shirks. What I learn I don't forget. Why, we gambled on the plains with a damn lot of cattlemen in ranches, paid fair, mind, and then had to fight for our winnings afterwards as often as not. We've gambled on the hills and in the valleys and on the seashore and out of sight of land, mostly fair. Generally it's good enough. We began in Nicaragua first, after we left that schooner and her fool errand. There were 127 sovereigns and some Mexican dollars in that skipper's cash box. Hardly enough to knock a man on the head for from behind, I must confess. But that the skipper had a narrow escape, the governor himself could not deny afterwards. Do you want me to understand, sir, that you mind there being one life more or less on this earth? I asked him, a few hours after we got away. Certainly not, says he. Well then, why did you stop me? There's a proper way of doing things. You'll have to learn to be correct. There's also unnecessary exertion. That must be avoided too, if only for the look of the thing. A gentleman's way of putting things to you. And no mistake. At sunrise we got into a creek to lie hidden in case the treasure hunt party had a mind to take a spell hunting for us. And dash me if they didn't. We saw the schooner away out, running to leeward, with 10 pairs of binoculars sweeping the sea, no doubt on all sides. I advised the governor to give her time to beat back again before we made a start, so we stayed up that creek something like 10 days, as snug as can be. On the 7th day we had to kill a man, though, the brother of this Pedro here. They were alligator hunters right enough. We got our lodgings in their hut. Neither the boss nor I could habla Espanol, speak Spanish, you know, much then. Dry bank, nice shade, jolly hammocks, fresh fish, good game, everything lovely. The governor chucked them a few dollars to begin with, but it was like boarding with a pair of savage apes anyhow. By and by we noticed them talking a lot together. They had twigged the cash box and the leather portmanteaus and my bag. A jolly lot of plunder to look at. They must have been saying to each other, no one's ever likely to come looking for these two fellows who seem to have fallen from the moon. Let's cut their throats. Why, of course, clear as daylight. I didn't need to spy one of them sharpening a devilish knife behind some bushes while glancing right and left with his wild eyes to know what was in the wind. Pedro was standing by, trying the edge of another long knife. They thought we were away on our lookout at the mouth of the river, as was usual with us during the day. Not that we expected to see much of the schooner, but it was just as well to make certain, if possible, and then it was cooler out of the woods, in the breeze. Well, the governor was there right enough, lying comfortable on a rug, where he could watch the offing, but I had gone back to the hut to get a chew of tobacco out of my bag. I had not broken myself of the habit then, and I couldn't be happy unless I had a lump as big as a baby's fist in my cheek. At the cannibalistic comparison, Schomburg muttered a faint, sickly, "Don't." Ricardo hitched himself up in his seat and glanced down his outstretched legs complacently. "I'm tolerably light in my feet, as a general thing," he went on. "Dash me if I don't think I could drop a pinch of salt in a sparrow's tail if I tried. Anyhow, they didn't hear me. I watched them two brown hairy brutes not 10 yards off. All they had on was white linen drawers rolled up on their thighs. Not a word they said to each other. Antonio was down on his thick hams, busy rubbing a knife on a flat stone. Pedro was leaning against a small tree and passing his thumb along the edge of his blade. I got away quieter than a mouse, you bet. I didn't say anything to the boss then. He was leaning on his elbow on his rug and didn't seem to want to be spoken to. He's like that. Sometimes that familiar you'd think he would eat out of your hand, and at others he would snub you sharper than the devil, but always quiet. Perfect gentleman, I tell you. I didn't bother him then, but I wasn't likely to forget them two fellows, so businesslike with their knives. At that time we had only one revolver between us two, the governor's 6-shooter, but he loaded only in 5 chambers, and we had no more cartridges. He had left the box behind in a drawer in his cabin. Awkward. I had nothing but an old clasp knife, no good at all for anything serious. In the evening we 4 sat round a bit of fire outside the sleeping shed, eating broiled fish off plantain leaves, with roast yams for bread, the usual thing. The governor and I were on one side, and these two beauties cross-legged on the other, grunting a word or two to each other now and then. Hardly human speech at all, and their eyes down, fast on the ground. For the last 3 days we couldn't get to them to look us in the face. Presently I began to talk to the boss quietly, just as I'm talking to you now, careless-like, and I told him all I had observed. He goes on picking the pieces of fish and putting them into his mouth as calm as anything. It's a pleasure to have anything to do with a gentleman. Never looked across at 'em once. And now, says I, yawning on purpose, we've got to stand watch at night, turn about, and keep our eyes skinned all day too, and mind we don't get jumped on suddenly. It's perfectly intolerable, says the governor, and you with no weapon of any sort. I mean to stick pretty close to you, sir, from this one on, if you don't mind, says I. He just nods the least bit, wipes his fingers on the plantain leaves, puts his hand behind his back, as if to help himself to rise off the ground, snatches his revolver from under his jacket, and plugs a bullet plumb centre in Mr. Antonio's chest. See what it is to have to do with a gentleman. No confounded fuss, and things down out of hand. But he might have tipped me a wink or something. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Scared, ain't in it? I didn't even know who had fired. Everything had been so still. Just before the bang of that shot seemed the loudest noise I'd ever heard. The Honourable Antonio pitches forward, they always do, towards the shot. You must have noticed that yourself. Yes, he pitches forward onto the embers and all that lot of hair on his face, and the head flashes up like a pinch of gunpowder. Greasy, I expect, always scraping the fat off them alligators' hides. Look here, exclaimed Schomburg violently, as if trying to burst some invisible bonds. Do you mean to say that all this happened? No, said Ricardo coolly. I'm making it up as I go along, just to help you through the hottest part of the afternoon. So down he pitches his nose onto the red embers, and up jumps our handsome Pedro and I at the same time, like two jacks in the box. He starts to bolt away, with his head over his shoulder, and I, hardly knowing what I was doing, spring onto his back. I had the sense to get my hands round his neck at once, and it's about all I could do to lock my fingers right under his jaw. You saw the beauty's neck, didn't you? Hard as iron, too. Down we both went. Seeing this, the governor puts his revolver in his pocket. Tie his legs together, sir, I yell. I'm trying to strangle him. There was a lot of their fibre lines lying about. I gave him a last squeeze and then got up. I might have shot you, said the governor, quite concerned. But you were glad to have saved the cartridge, sir, I tell him. My jump did save it. It wouldn't have done to let him get away in the dark like that, and have the beauty dodging round in the bushes, perhaps, with the rusty flintlock gun they had. The governor owned up that the jump was the correct thing. But he isn't dead, said he, bending over him. Might as well hope to strangle an ox. We made haste to tie his elbows back, and then, before he came to himself, we dragged him to a small tree, set him up, and bound him to it, not by the waist, but by the neck. Some 20 turns of small line round his throat and the trunk, finished off with a reef knot under his ear. Next thing we did was attend to the Honourable Antonio, who was making a great smell, frizzling his face on the red coals. We pushed and rolled him into the creek and left the rest to the alligators. I was tired. That little scrap took it out of me something awful. The governor hadn't turned a hair. That's where a gentleman has the pull of you. He don't get excited. No gentleman does. Or hardly ever. I fell asleep all of a sudden and left him smoking by the fire I'd made up, his railway rug round his legs, as calm as if he was sitting in a first-class carriage. We hardly spoke 10 words to each other after it was over, and from that day to this we never talked of the business. I wouldn't have known he remembered it if he hadn't alluded to it when talking with you the other day, you know, with regard to Pedro. It surprised you, didn't it? That's why I'm giving you this yarn of how he came to be with us, like a sort of dog. Dashed sight more useful, though. You know how he can trot round with trays? Well, he could bring down an ox with his fist at a word from the boss just as cleverly. And fond of the governor? Oh, my word! More than any dog is of any man. Schomburg squared his chest. Oh, and that's one of the things I wanted to mention to Mr. Jones, he said. It's unpleasant to have that fellow round the house so early. He sits on the stairs at the back for hours before he is needed here, and frightens people so that the service suffers. The Chinaman— Ricardo nodded and raised his hand. When I first saw him, he was fit to frighten a grizzly bear, let alone a Chinaman. He's become civilised now to what he once was. Well, that morning, first thing on opening my eyes, I saw him sitting there, tied up by the neck to the tree. He was blinking. We spent the day watching the sea, and we actually made out the schooner working to windward, which showed that she had given us up. Good. When the sun rose again, I took a squint at our Pedro. He wasn't blinking. He was rolling his eyes, all white one minute and black the next, and his tongue was hanging out a yard. Being tied up short by the neck like this would daunt the archdevil himself in time. In time, mind. I don't know but that even a real gentleman would find it difficult to keep a stiff lip to the end. Presently we went to work getting our boat ready. I was busying myself setting up the mast, when the governor passes the remark, "I think he wants to say something." I had heard a sort of croaking going on for some time, only I wouldn't take any notice. But then I got out of the boat and went up to him with some water. His eyes were red and black and half out of his head. He drank all the water I gave him, but hadn't much to say for himself. I walked back to the governor. "He asked for a bullet in the head before we go," I said. I wasn't at all pleased. "Oh, That's out of the question altogether, says the governor. He was right there. Only 4 shots left, and 90 miles of wild coast to put behind us before coming to the first place where you could expect to buy any revolver cartridges. Anyhow, I tell him, he wants to be killed some way or another, as a favour, and then I go on setting up the boat's mast. I didn't care much for the notion of butchering a man, bound hand and foot and fastened by the neck besides. I had a knife then, the Honourable Antonio's knife, and that knife is this knife. Ricardo gave his leg a resounding slap. First spoiling my new life, he went on with harsh joviality. The dodge of carrying it down there I learnt later. I carried it stuck in my belt that day. No, I hadn't much stomach for the job. But when you work with a gentleman of the real right sort, you may depend on your feelings being seen through your skin. Says the governor suddenly, it may even be looked upon as his right. You hear a gentleman speaking there? But what do you think of taking him with us in the boat? And the governor starts arguing that the beggar would be useful in working our way along the coast. We could get rid of him before coming to the first place that was a little civilised. I didn't want much talking over. I scrambled from the boat. Aye, but will he be manageable, sir? Oh, yes. He's daunted. Go on, cut him loose. I take the responsibility. Right you are, sir. He sees me coming along smartly with his brother's knife in my hand. I wasn't thinking how it looked from his side of the fence, you know. And Jiminy, it nearly killed him. He stared like a crazed bullock and began to sweat and twitch all over. Something amazing. I was so surprised that I stopped to look at him. The drops were pouring over his eyebrows, down his beard, off his nose, and he gurgled. Then it struck me that he couldn't see what was in my mind. By favour or by right, he didn't like to die when it came to it. Not in that way, anyhow. When I stepped round to get at the lashing, he let out a sort of soft bellow. Thought I was going to stick him from behind, I guess. I cut all the turns with one slash, and he went over on his side, flop, and started kicking with his tied legs. Laugh! I don't know what there was so funny about it, but I fairly shouted. What between my laughing and his wriggling, I had a job in cutting him free. As soon as he could feel his limbs, he makes for the bank, where the governor was standing, crawls up to him on his hands and knees, and embraces his legs. Gratitude, eh? You could see that being allowed to live suited that chap down to the ground. The governor gets his legs away from him gently and just mutters to me, let's be off. Get him into the boat. It was not difficult, continued Ricardo, after eyeing Schomberg fixedly for a moment. He was ready enough to get into the boat, and here he is. He would let himself be chopped into small pieces, with a smile, mind, with a smile, for the governor. I don't know about him doing that much for me, but pretty near, pretty near. I did the tying up and the untying, but he could see he was the boss. And then he knows a gentleman. A dog knows a gentleman, any dog. It's only some foreigners that don't know, and nothing could teach them either. And you mean to say, asked Schomberg, disregarding what might have been annoying for himself in the emphasis of the final remark, you mean to say that you left steady employment at good wages for a life like this? There, began Ricardo quietly. That's just what a man like you would say. You are that tame. I follow a gentleman. That ain't the same thing as to serve an employer. They give you wages as they'd fling a bone to a dog, and they expect you to be grateful. It's worse than slavery. You don't expect a slave that's bought for money to be grateful. And if you sell your work, what is it but selling your own self? You've got so many days to live, and you sell them one after another. Hey, who can pay me enough for my life? Hey? But they throw at you your week's money and expect you to say thank you before you pick it up. He mumbled some curses, directed at employers generally, as it seemed, then blazed out, Work be damned! I ain't a dog walking on its hind legs for a bone. I'm a man who's following a gentleman. There's a difference which you will never understand, Mr. Tamed Schomberg. He yawned slightly. Schomberg, preserving a military stiffness, reinforced by a slight frown, had allowed his thoughts to stray away. They were busy detailing the image of a young girl, absent, gone, stolen from him. He became enraged. There was that rascal looking at him insolently. If the girl had not been shamefully decoyed away from him, he would not have allowed anyone to look at him insolently. He would have made nothing of hitting that rogue between the eyes. Afterwards he would have kicked the other without hesitation. He saw himself doing it, and in sympathy with this glorious vision, Schomberg's right foot and arm moved convulsively. At this moment he came out of his sudden reverie to note with alarm the wide-eyed curiosity of Mr. Ricardo's stare. "And so you go like this about the world, gambling," he remarked inanely, to cover his confusion. But Ricardo's stare did not change its character, and he continued vaguely, "Here and there and everywhere." He pulled himself together, squared his shoulders. "Isn't it very precarious?" he said firmly. The word precarious seemed to be effective, because Ricardo's eyes lost their dangerously interested expression. "No, not so bad," Ricardo said with indifference. "It's my opinion that men will gamble as long as they have anything to put on a card. Gamble? That's nature. What's life itself? You never know what may turn up. The worst of it is that you never can tell exactly what sort of cards you're holding yourself. What's trumps? That's the question. See? Any man'll gamble, if only he's given a chance, for anything or everything. You too." "I haven't touched a card now for 20 years, said Schomberg in an austere tone. "Well, if you got your living that way, you would be no worse than you are now, selling drinks to people. Beastly beer and spirits. Rotten stuff, fit to make an old he-goat yell if you poured it down its throat. Pah! I can't stand the confounded liquor. Never could. A whiff of neat brandy in a glass makes me feel sick. Always did. If everybody was like me, liquor would be going a-begging. You think it's funny in a man, don't you?" Schomberg made a vague gesture of toleration. Ricardo hitched up his chair and settled his elbow afresh on the table. "French Syros, I must say I do like. Saigon's the place for them. I see you have Syros in the bar. Hang me if I ain't getting dry, conversing like this with you. Come, Mr. Schomberg, be hospitable, as the governor says." Schomberg rose and walked with dignity to the counter. His footsteps echoed loudly on the floor of polished boards. He took down a bottle labelled Sirop de Groseille. The little sounds he made, the clink of glass, the gurgling of the liquid, the pop of the soda-water cork had a preternatural sharpness. He came back carrying a pink and glistening tumbler. Mr. Ricardo had followed his movements with oblique, coyly expectant yellow eyes, like a cat watching the preparation of a saucer of milk, and the satisfied sound after he had drunk what might have been a slightly modified form of purring, very soft and deep in his throat. It affected Schomberg unpleasantly, as another example of something inhuman in those men wherein lie the difficulty of dealing with them. A spectre, a cat, an ape. There was a pretty association for a mere man to remonstrate with, he reflected with an inward shudder, for Schomberg had been overpowered, as it were, by his imagination, and his reason could not react against that fanciful view of his guests. And it was not only their appearance. The morals of Mr. Ricardo seemed to him to be pretty much the morals of a cat. Too much. What sort of argument could a mere man offer to a spectre either? What the morals of a spectre could be, Schomberg had no idea. Something dreadful, no doubt. Compassion certainly had no place in them. As to the ape, well, everybody knew what an ape was. It had no morals. Nothing could be more hopeless. Outwardly, however, having picked up the cigar which he had laid aside to get the drink with his thick fingers, one of them ornamented by a gold ring, Schomberg smoked with moody composure. Facing him, Ricardo blinked slowly for a time, then closed his eyes altogether, with the placidity of the domestic cat dozing on the hearthrug. In another moment he opened them very wide, and seemed surprised to see Schomberg there. "You're having a very slack time to-day, aren't you?" he observed. "But then, this whole town is confoundedly slack anyhow, and I've never faced such a slack party at a table before. Come 11 o'clock, they begin to talk of breaking up. What's the matter with them? Want to go to bed so early, or what?" "I reckon you don't lose a fortune by their wanting to go to bed," said Schomburg with sombre sarcasm. No, admitted Ricardo, with a grin that stretched his thin mouth from ear to ear, giving a sudden glimpse of his white teeth. Only, you see, when I once start, I would play for nuts, for parched peas, for any rubbish. I would play them for their souls. But these Dutchmen aren't any good. They never seem to get warmed up properly, win or lose. I've tried them both ways too. Hang 'em for a beggarly, bloodless lot of animated cucumbers. And if anything out of the way was to happen, they would be just as cool in knocking you and your gentleman up, Schomburg snarled unpleasantly. Indeed, said Ricardo slowly, taking Schomburg's measure with his eyes. And what about you? You talk mighty big, burst out the hotel keeper. You talk of ranging all over the world, and doing great things, and taking fortune by the scruff of the neck, but here you stick at this miserable business. It isn't much of a lay, that's a fact, admitted Ricardo unexpectedly. Schomburg was red in the face with audacity. I call it paltry, he spluttered. That's how it looks. Can't call it anything else. Ricardo seemed to be in an accommodating mood. I should be ashamed of it myself. Only, you see, the governor is subject to fits. Fits? Schomburg cried out, but in a low tone. You don't say so. He exulted inwardly, as if this disclosure had in some way diminished the difficulty of the situation. Fits? That's a serious thing, isn't it? You ought to take him to the civil hospital. A lovely place. Ricardo nodded slightly, with a faint grin. Serious enough. Regular fits of laziness, I call them. Now and then he lays down on me like this, and there's no moving him. If you think I like it, you're a long way out. Generally speaking, I can talk him over. I know how to deal with a gentleman. I'm no daily bread slave. But when he has said, Martin, I am bored, then look out. There's nothing to do but to shut up. Confound it. Schomburg, very much cast down, had listened open-mouthed. What's the cause of it? He asked. Why is he like this? I don't understand. I think I do, said Ricardo. A gentleman, you know, is not such a simple person as you or I, and not so easy to manage either. If only I had something to lever him out with. What do you mean, to lever him out with? Muttered Schomburg hopelessly. Ricardo was impatient with this denseness. Don't you understand English? Look here. I couldn't make this billiard table move an inch if I talked to it from now till the end of days, could I? Well, the governor's like that too, when the fits are on him. He's bored. Nothing's worthwhile. Nothing's good enough. That's mere sense. But if I saw Capstan Bar lying about here, I would soon manage to shift that billiard table of yours a good many inches, and that's all there is to it. He rose noiselessly, stretched himself, subtle and stealthy, with curious sideways movements of his head and unexpected elongations of his thick body, glanced out of the corner of his eyes in the direction of the door, and finally leaned back against the table, folding his arms on his breast comfortably, in a completely human attitude. That's another thing you can tell a gentleman by, his freakishness. A gentleman ain't accountable to nobody, any more than a tramp on the roads. He ain't got to keep time. The governor got like this once in a one-horse Mexican pueblo on the uplands, away from everywhere. He lay all day long in a dark room. Drunk? This word escaped Schomburg by inadvertence, at which he became frightened. But the devoted secretary seemed to find it natural. No, that never comes on together with this kind of fit. He just lay there full length on a mat, while a ragged, bare-legged boy that he'd picked up in the street sat in the patio, between two oleanders near the open door of his room, strumming on a guitar and singing tristes to him from morning till night. You know, tristes. Twang, twang, twang. Oh, ooh, true, yeah. Schomburg uplifted his hands in distress. This tribute seemed to flatter Ricardo. His mouth twitched grimly. Like that? Enough to give colic to an ostrich, eh? Awful. Well, there was a cook once who loved me, an old fat Negro woman with spectacles. I used to hide in the kitchen and turn to her to make me dulces, sweet things, you know, mostly eggs and sugar, to pass the time away. I'm like a kid for sweet things. And by the way, why don't you ever have a pudding at your tabby dot, Mr. Schomburg? Nothing but fruit, morning, noon and night. Sickening. What do you think a fellow is? A wasp? Schomburg disregarded the injured tone. And how long's it that fit, as you call it, last? He asked anxiously. Weeks, months, years, centuries, it seemed to me, returned Ricardo with feeling. Of an evening the governor would just stroll out into the sala and fritter his life away, playing cards with a Jewess of the place. A little dago with a pair of black whiskers. Écarté, you know. A quick French game for small change. And the commandante, a one-eyed, half-Indian, flat-nosed ruffian, and I, we had to stand around and bet on their hands. It was awful. Awful, echoed Schomburg in a Teutonic throaty tone of despair. Look here, I need your rooms. To be sure, I've been thinking that for some time past, said Ricardo indifferently. I was mad when I listened to you. This must end. I think you're mad yet, said Ricardo, not even unfolding his arms or shifting his attitude an inch. He lowered his voice to add, and if I thought you had been to the police, I would tell Pedro to catch you round the waist and break your fat neck by jerking your head backward. Snap! I saw him do it to a big-buck negro who was flourishing a razor in front of the governor. It can be done. You hear a low crack, that's all, and the man drops down like a limp rag. Not even Ricardo's head, slightly inclined on the left shoulder, had moved. But when he ceased, the greenish irises which had been staring out of doors glided into the corners of his eyes nearest to Schomburg, and stayed there with a coyly voluptuous expression. Chapter 8. Schomburg felt desperation, that lamentable substitute for courage, ooze out of him. It was not so much the threat of death as the weirdly circumstantial manner of its declaration which affected him. A mere, "I'll murder you," however ferocious in tone and earnest in purpose, he could have faced. But before this novel mode of speech and procedure, his imagination being very sensitive to the unusual, he collapsed as if indeed his moral neck had been broken. Snap! Go to the police? Of course not. Never dreamed of it. Too late now. I've let myself be mixed up in this. You've got my consent while I wasn't myself. Explained it to you at the time. Ricardo's eye glided gently off Schomburg to stare far away. Aye, some trouble with a girl, but that's nothing to us. Naturally. What I say is, what's the good of all that savage talk to me? A bright argument occurred to him. It's out of proportion. For even if I were fool enough to go to the police now, there's nothing serious to complain about. It would only mean deportation for you. They would put you on board the first westbound steamer to Singapore. He had become animated. Out of this to the devil, he added between his teeth for his own private satisfaction. Ricardo made no comment, and gave no sign of having heard a single word. This discouraged Schomburg, who had looked up hopefully. Why do you want to stick here? He cried. It can't pay you people to fool around like this. Didn't you worry just now about moving your governor? Well, the police would move him for you, and from Singapore you can go on to the east coast of Africa. I'll be hanged if the fellow isn't up to that silly trick, was Ricardo's comment, spoken in an ominous tone which recalled Schomburg to the realities of his position. No, he protested. It's a manner of speaking. Of course I wouldn't. I think that trouble about the girl has really muddled your brains, Mr. Schomburg. Believe me, you had better part friends with us. For deportation or no deportation, you be seeing one of us turning up before long to pay you off for any nasty dodge you may be hatching in that fat head of yours. Got him, Himmel, croaked Schomburg. Will nothing move him out? Will he stop here, immer? I mean always? Suppose I were to make it worth your while, couldn't you? No, Ricardo interrupted. I couldn't. Unless I had something to lever him out with. I've told you that before. An inducement? Muttered Schomburg. Aye. The east coast of Africa isn't good enough. He told me the other day that he'll have to wait till he's ready for it, and he may not be ready for a long time, because the east coast can't run away, and no one is likely to run off with it. These remarks, whether considered as truisms or as depicting Mr. Jones's mental state, were distinctly discouraging to the long-suffering Schomburg. But there is truth in the well-known saying that places the darkest hour before the dawn. The sound of words, apart from the context, has its power, and these two words, run off, had a special affinity to the hotel-keeper's haunting idea. It was always present in his brain, and now it came forward evoked by a purely fortuitous expression. No, nobody could run off with a continent, but Haste had run off with the girl. Ricardo could have no conception of the cause of Schomburg's changed expression, yet it was noticeable enough to interest him so much that he stopped the careless swinging of his leg and said, looking at the hotel-keeper, "There's not much use arguing against that sort of talk, is there?" Schomburg was not listening. "I could put you on another track," he said slowly, and stopped, as if suddenly choked by an unholy emotion of intense eagerness, combined with a fear of failure. Ricardo waited, attentive, yet not without a certain contempt. "On the track of a man," Schomburg uttered convulsively, and paused again, consulting his rage and his conscience. "A man in the moon, eh?" suggested Ricardo, in a jeering murmur. Schomburg shook his head. "It would be nearly as safe to rook him as if he were the man in the moon. You go and try. It isn't so very far." He reflected. These men were thieves and murderers as well as gamblers. Their fitness for purposes of vengeance was appallingly complete. But he preferred not to think of it in detail. He put it to himself summarily that he would be paying Haste out, and would, at the same time, relieve himself of these men's oppression. He had only to let loose his natural gift for talking scandalously about his fellow creatures, and in this case his great practice of it was assisted by hate, which, like love, has an eloquence of its own. With the utmost ease he portrayed for Ricardo, now seriously attentive, a Haste fattened by years of private and public rapines, the murderer of Morrison, the swindler of many shareholders, a wonderful mixture of craft and impudence, of deep purposes and simple wiles, of mystery and futility. In this exercise of his natural function Schomburg revived, the colour coming back to his face, loquacious, florid, eager, his manliness set off by his military bearing. "That's the exact story. He was seen hanging about this part of the world for years, spying into everybody's business. But I am the only one who has seen through him, from the first. Contemptible, double-faced, stick-at-nothing, dangerous fellow." "Dangerous, is he?" Schomburg came to himself at the sound of Ricardo's voice. "Well, you know what I mean," he said uneasily. A lying, circumventing, soft-spoken, polite, stuck-up rascal. Nothing open about him." Mr. Ricardo had slipped off the table and was prowling about the room in an oblique, noiseless manner. He flashed a grin at Schomburg in passing, and a snarling, "Ah, Well, what more dangerous do you want?" argued Schomburg. "He's in no way a fighting man, I believe," he added negligently. "And you say he's been living alone there?" "Like the man in the moon," answered Schomburg readily. "There's no one that cares a rap what becomes of him. He has been lying low, you understand, after bagging all that plunder." "Plunder, eh? Why didn't he go home with it?" inquired Ricardo. The henchman of plain Mr. Jones was beginning to think that this was something worth looking into, and he was pursuing truth in the manner of men of sounder morality and purer intentions than his own. That is, he pursued it in the light of his own experience and prejudices. For facts, whatever their origin, and God only knows where they come from, can only be tested by our own particular suspicions. Ricardo was suspicious all round. Schomburg, such is the tonic of recovered self-esteem, retorted fearlessly, "Go home? Why don't you go home? To hear your talk you must have made a pretty considerable pile, going round winning people's money. You ought to be ready by this time." Ricardo stopped to look at Schomburg with surprise. "You think yourself very clever, don't you?" he said. Schomburg just then was so conscious of being clever that the snarling irony left him unmoved. There was positively a smile in his noble Teutonic beard, the first smile for weeks. He was in a felicitous vein. How do you know that he wasn't thinking of going home? As a matter of fact, he was on his way home. And how do I know that you're not amusing yourself by spinning out a blamed fairy tale? Interrupted Ricardo roughly. I wonder at myself listening to the silly rot. Schomberg received this turn of temper unmoved. He did not require to be very subtly observant to notice that he had managed to arouse some sort of feeling, perhaps of greed, in Ricardo's breast. You won't believe me? Well, you can ask anybody that comes here if that Swede hadn't gone as far as this house on his way home. Why should he turn up here if not for that? You ask anybody. Ask indeed, returned the other. Catch me asking at large about a man I mean to drop on. Such jobs must be done on the quiet, or not at all. The peculiar intonation of the last phrase touched the nape of Schomberg's neck with a chill. He cleared his throat slightly, and looked away as though he had heard something indelicate. Then, with a jump as it were, Of course you didn't tell me. Is it likely? But haven't I got eyes? Haven't I got my common sense to tell me? I can see through people. By the same token, he called on the Tesmans. Why did he call on the Tesmans 2 days running, eh? You don't know? You can't tell? He waited complacently till Ricardo had finished swearing quite openly at him for a confounded chatterer, and then went on. A fellow doesn't go to a counting-house in business hours for a chat about the weather 2 days running. Then why? To close his account with them one day, and to get his money out of the next. Clear, what? Ricardo, with his trick of looking one way and moving another, approached Schomberg slowly. To get his money, he purred. Gewiss, snapped Schomberg with impatient superiority. What else? That is, only the money he had with the Tesmans. What he has buried or put away on the island, devil only knows. When you think of the lot of hard cash that passed through that man's hands for wages and stores and all that, and he's just a cunning thief, I tell you. Ricardo's hard stare discomposed the hotel keeper, and he added in an embarrassed tone, I mean, a common, sneaking thief. No account at all. And he calls himself a Swedish baron, too. He's a baron, is he? That foreign nobility ain't much, commented Mr. Ricardo seriously. And then what? He hung about here? Yes, he hung about, said Schomberg, making a wry mouth. He hung about. That's it. Hung. His voice died out. Curiosity was depicted in Ricardo's countenance. Just like that, for nothing. And then he turned about and went back to that island again. And went back to that island again, Schomberg echoed lifelessly, fixing his gaze on the floor. What's the matter with you? Asked Ricardo with genuine surprise. What is it? Schomberg, without looking up, made an impatient gesture. His face was crimson, and he kept it lowered. Ricardo went back to the point. Well, but how do you account for it? What was his reason? What did he go back to the island for? Honeymoon, spat out Schomberg viciously. Perfectly still, his eyes downcast, he suddenly, with no preliminary stir, hit the table with his fist, a blow which caused the utterly unprepared Ricardo to leap aside. And only then did Schomberg look up with a dull, resentful expression. Ricardo stared hard for a moment, spun on his heel, walked to the end of the room, came back smartly, and muffled a profound "Aye" above Schomberg's rigid head. That the hotel-keeper was capable of a great moral effort was proved by a gradual return of his severe lieutenant of the reserve manner. Aye, repeated Ricardo, more deliberately than before, as if after a further survey of the circumstances. I wish I hadn't asked you, or that you had told me a lie. It doesn't suit me to know that there's a woman mixed up in this affair. What's she like? It's the girl you... Leave off, muttered Schomberg, utterly pitiful behind his stiff military front. Aye, Ricardo ejaculated for the third time, more and more enlightened and perplexed. Can't bear to talk about it. So bad as that. And yet I would bet she isn't a miracle to look at. Schomberg made a gesture as if he didn't know, as if he didn't care. Then he squared his shoulders and frowned at vacancy. Swedish baron. Ricardo continued meditatively. I believe the governor would think that business worth looking up. Quite, if I put it to him properly. The governor likes a duel, if you call it so, but I don't know a man that can stand up to him on the square. Have you ever seen a cat play with a mouse? It's a pretty sight. Ricardo, with his voluptuously gleaming eyes and the coy expression, looked so much like a cat that Schomberg would have felt all the alarm of a mouse if other feelings had not had complete possession of his breast. "There are no lies between you and me," he said, more steadily than he thought he could speak. "What's the good now? He funks women. In that Mexican pueblo where we lay grounded on our beef bones, so to speak, I used to go off to dances of an evening. The girls there would ask me if the English cavallero in the posada was a monk in disguise, or if he'd taken a vow to the Sanctissima Madre not to speak to a woman, or whether... you imagine what fairly free-spoken girls will ask when they come to the point of not caring what they say. And it used to vex me. Yes, the governor funks facing women." "One woman?" interjected Schomberg in guttural tones. "One may be more awkward to deal with than 2, or 200 for that matter. In a place that's full of women, you needn't look at them unless you like. But if you go into a room where there is only one woman, young or old, pretty or ugly, you've got to face her. And unless you're after her, then the governor is right enough. She's in the way." "Why notice them?" muttered Schomberg. "What can they do?" "Make a noise, if nothing else," opined Mr. Ricardo curtly, with the distaste of a man whose path is a path of silence. For indeed nothing is more odious than a noise where one is engaged in a weighty and absorbing card game. "Noise, noise, my friend," he went on forcibly. "Confounded screeching about something or other, and I like it no more than the governor does. But with the governor there's something else besides. He can't stand them at all." He paused to reflect on this psychological phenomenon, and as no philosopher was at hand to tell him that there is no strong sentiment without some terror, as there is no real religion without a little fetishism, he emitted his own conclusion, which surely could not go to the root of the matter. "I'm hanged if I don't think they are to him what liquor is to me. Brandy! Pah!" He made a disgusted face, and produced a genuine shudder. Schomberg listened to him in wonder. It looked as if the very scoundrelism of that Swede would protect him, the spoil of his iniquity standing between the thief and the retribution. "That's so, old buck." Ricardo broke the silence, after contemplating Schomberg's moot dejection with a sort of sympathy. "I don't think this trick'll work." "But that's silly," whispered the man deprived of the vengeance which he had seemed already to hold in his hand by a mysterious and exasperating idiosyncrasy. "Don't you set yourself to judge a gentleman." Ricardo, without anger, administered a moody rebuke. "Even I can't understand the governor thoroughly, and I am an Englishman, and his follower. No, I don't think I'll care to put it before him, sick as I am of staying here." Ricardo could not be more sick of staying than Schomberg was of seeing him stay. Schomberg believed so firmly in the reality of haste as created by his own power of false inferences, of his hate, of his love of scandal, that he could not contain a stifled cry of conviction as sincere as most of our convictions. The disguised servants of our passions can appear at a supreme moment. "It would have been like going to pick up a nugget of £1,000, or 2 or 3 times as much, for all I know. No trouble, no?" "A petticoat's the trouble," Ricardo struck in. He had resumed his noiseless, feline, oblique prowling, in which an observer would have detected a new character of excitement, such as a wild animal of the cat species, anxious to make a spring, might betray. Schomberg saw nothing. It would probably have cheered his drooping spirits, but in a general way he preferred not to look at Ricardo. Ricardo, however, with one of his slanting, gliding, restless glances, observed the bitter smile on Schomberg's bearded lips, the unmistakable smile of ruined hopes. "You're a pretty unforgiving sort of chap," he said, stopping for a moment with an air of interest. "Hang me if I ever saw anybody look so disappointed. I'll bet you would send black plague to that island, if only you knew how. Eh, what? Plague too good for 'em? Ha, ha, ha!" He bent down to stare at Schomberg, who sat unstirring with stony eyes and set features, and apparently deaf to the rasping derision of that laughter so close to his red fleshy ear. Black play too good for him. Ha ha ha! Ricardo pressed the point on the tormented hotel-keeper. Schomburg kept his eyes down obstinately. I don't wish any harm to the girl, he muttered. But did she bolt from you? A fair bilk? Come! Devil only knows what that villainous Swede has done to her, what he promised her, how he frightened her. She couldn't have cared for him, I know. Schomburg's vanity clung to the belief in some atrocious, extraordinary means of seduction employed by haste. Look how he bewitched that poor Morrison, he murmured. Ah, Morrison. Got all his money, what? Yes, and his life. Terrible fellow, that Swedish baron. How is one to get at him? Schomburg exploded. 3 against 1. Are you shy? Do you want me to give you a letter of introduction? You ought to look at yourself in a glass, Ricardo said quietly. Dash me if you don't get a stroke of some kind presently. And this is a fellow who says women can do nothing, that one will do for you unless you manage to forget her. I wish I could, Schomburg admitted earnestly. And it's all the doing of that Swede. I don't get enough sleep, Mr. Ricardo. And then, to finish me off, you gentlemen turn up. As if I hadn't enough worry. That's done you good, suggested the secretary with ironic seriousness. Takes your mind off that silly trouble. At your age, too. He checked himself, as if in pity, and changing his tone. I'd really like to oblige you while doing a stroke of business at the same time. A good stroke, insisted Schomburg, as if it were mechanically. In his simplicity he was not able to give up the idea which had entered his head. An idea must be driven out by another idea, and with Schomburg ideas were rare and therefore tenacious. Minted gold, he murmured with a sort of anguish. Such an expressive combination of words was not without effect upon Ricardo. Both these men were amenable to the influence of verbal suggestions. The secretary of plain Mr. Jones sighed and murmured, Yes, but I always want to get at it. Being 3 to 1, said Schomburg, I suppose you could get it for the asking. One would think the fellow lived next door, Ricardo growled impatiently. Hang it all, can't you understand a plain question? I've asked you the way. Schomburg seemed to revive. The way? The torpor of deceived hopes underlying his superficial changes of mood had been pricked by these words which seemed pointed with purpose. The way's over the water, of course, said the hotel-keeper. For people like you, 3 days in a good big boat is nothing. At this season, it's no more than a little outing, a bit of change. At this season, the Java Sea is a pond. I have an excellent safe boat, a ship's lifeboat. Carries 30, let alone 3, and a child could handle her. You won't get a wet face at this time of the year. You might call it a pleasure trip. And yet, having this boat, you didn't go after her yourself, or after him. Well, you're a fine fellow for a disappointed lover. Schomburg gave a start at the suggestion. I am not 3 men, he said sulkily, as the shortest answer of the several he could have given. Oh, I know your sort, Ricardo let fall negligently. You're like most people, or perhaps just a little more peaceable than the rest of the buying and selling gang that bosses this rotten show. Well, well, you respectable citizen, he went on. Let us go thoroughly into the matter. When Schomburg had been made to understand that Mr. Jones's henchman was ready to discuss, in his own words, this boat of yours with courses and distances, and such concrete matters of no good augury to that villainous Swede, he recovered his soldierly bearing, squared his shoulders, and asked in his military manner, You wish, then, to proceed with the business? Ricardo nodded. He had a great mind to, he said. A gentleman had to be humoured as much as possible, but he must be managed, too, on occasions, for his own good. And it was the business of the right sort of follower to know the proper time and the proper methods of that delicate part of his duty. Having exposed this theory, Ricardo proceeded to the application. I've never actually lied to him, he said, and I ain't going to now. I shall just say nothing about the girl. He'll have to get over the shock the best he can. Hang it all, too much humouring won't do here. Funny thing, Schomburg observed crisply. Is it? Oh, you wouldn't mind taking a woman by the throat in some dark corner and nobody by, I bet. Ricardo's dreadful, vicious, cat-like readiness to get his claws out at any moment startled Schomberg as usual. But it was provoking, too. "And you?" he defended himself. "Don't you want me to believe you are up to anything?" "I, my boy? Oh, yes. I am not that gentleman. Neither are you. Take 'em by the throat or chuck 'em under the chin is all one to me, almost," affirmed Ricardo, with something obscurely ironical in his complacency. "Now, as to this business. A 3 days' jaunt in a good boat isn't the thing to frighten people like us. You're right so far. But there are other details." Schomberg was ready enough to enter into details. He explained that he had a small plantation with a fairly habitable hut on it on Madura. He proposed that his guest should start from town in his boat, as if going for an excursion to that rural spot. The custom-house people on the quay were used to see his boat go off on such trips. From Madura, after some repose and on a convenient day, Mr. Jones and party would make the real start. It would all be plain sailing. Schomberg undertook to provision the boat. The greatest hardship the voyagers need apprehend would be a mild shower of rain. At that season of the year there were no serious thunderstorms. Schomberg's heart began to thump as he saw himself nearing his vengeance. His speech was thick but persuasive. "No risk at all. None whatsoever." Ricardo dismissed these assurances of safety with an impatient gesture. He was thinking of other risks. "The getting away from here is all right, but we may be sighted at sea, and that may bring awkwardness later on. A ship's boat with 3 white men in her, knocking about out of sight of land, is bound to make talk. Are we likely to be seen on our way?" "No, unless by native craft," said Schomberg. Ricardo nodded, satisfied. Both these white men looked on native life as a mere play of shadows. A play of shadows the dominant race could walk through unaffected and disregarded in the pursuit of its incomprehensible aims and needs. No, native craft did not count, of course. It was an empty, solitary part of the sea, Schomberg expounded further. Only the Ternate mail boat crossed that region about the 8th of every month, regularly. Nowhere near the island, though. Rigid, his voice hoarse, his heart thumping, his mind concentrated on the success of his plan, the hotel-keeper multiplied words as if to keep as many of them as possible between himself and the murderous aspect of his purpose. "So, if you gentlemen depart from my plantation quietly at sunset on the 8th, always best to make a start at night, with a land breeze, it's 100 to 1. What am I saying? It's 1,000 to 1 that no human eye will see you on the passage. All you've got to do is keep her heading northeast for, say, 50 hours. Perhaps not quite so long. There will always be draft enough to keep a boat moving. You may reckon on that, and then—" The muscles about his waist quivered under his clothes with eagerness, with impatience, and with something like apprehension, the true nature of which was not clear to him, and he did not want to investigate it. Ricardo regarded him steadily, with those dry eyes of his shining more like polished stones than living tissue. "And then what?" he asked. "And then, why, you will astonish der Herr Baron. Ha ha ha!" Schomberg seemed to force the words and the laugh out of himself in a hoarse bass. "And you believe he has all that plunder by him?" asked Ricardo, rather perfunctorily, because the fact seemed to him extremely probable when looked at all around by his acute mind. Schomberg raised his hands and lowered them slowly. "How can it be otherwise? He was going home. He was on his way, in this hotel. Ask people. Was it likely he would leave it behind him?" Ricardo was thoughtful. Then suddenly, raising his head, he remarked, "Steer north-east for 50 hours, eh? That's not much of a sailing direction. I've heard of a port being missed before on better information. Well, can't you say what sort of landfall a fellow may expect? But I suppose you've never seen that island yourself?" Schomberg admitted that he had not seen it, in a tone in which a man congratulates himself on having escaped the contamination of an unsavoury experience. No, certainly not. He had never had any business to call there. But what of that? He could give Mr. Ricardo as good a sea mark as anybody need wish for. He laughed nervously. Miss it? He defied anyone that came within 40 miles of it to miss the retreat of that villainous Swede. What do you think of a pillar of smoke by day and a loom of fire at night? There's a volcano in full blast near that island. Enough to guide almost a blind man. What more do you want? An active volcano to steer by?" These last words he roared out exultingly, then jumped up and glared. The door to the left of the bar had swung open, and Mrs. Schomburg, dressed for duty, stood facing him down the whole length of the room. She clung to the handle for a moment, then came in and glided to her place, where she sat down to stare straight before her, as usual. Part 3. Chapter 1. Tropical nature had been kind to the failure of the commercial enterprise. The desolation of the headquarters of the Tropical Belt Coal Company had been screened from the side of the sea, from the side where prying eyes, if any were sufficiently interested, either in malice or in sorrow, could have noted the decaying bones of that once sanguine enterprise. Haste had been sitting among the bones buried so kindly in the grass of 2 wet seasons' growth. The silence of his surroundings, broken only by such sounds as the distant roll of thunder, the lash of rain through the foliage of some big trees, the noise of the wind tossing the leaves of the forest, and of the short seas breaking against the shore, favoured rather than hindered his solitary meditation. A meditation is always, in a white man at least, more or less an interrogative exercise. Haste meditated in simple terms on the mystery of his actions, and he answered himself with the honest reflection, "There must be a lot of the original Adam in me, after all." He reflected, too, with the sense of making a discovery, that this primeval ancestor is not easily suppressed. The oldest voice in the world is just the one that never ceases to speak. If anybody could have silenced its imperative echoes, it should have been Haste's father, with his contemptuous, inflexible negation of all effort. But apparently he could not. There was in the son a lot of that first ancestor who, as soon as he could uplift his muddy frame from the celestial mould, started inspecting and naming the animals of that paradise which he was so soon to lose. Action, the first thought, or perhaps the first impulse on earth, the barbed hook baited with the illusions of progress to bring out of the lightless void the shoals of unnumbered generations. "And I, the son of my father, have been caught too, like the silliest fish of them all," Haste said to himself. He suffered. He was hurt by the sight of his own life, which ought to have been a masterpiece of aloofness. He remembered always his last evening with his father. He remembered the thin features, the great mass of white hair, and the ivory complexion. A 5-branched candlestick stood on a little table by the side of the easy chair. They had been talking a long time. The noises of the street had died out one by one, till at last, in the moonlight, the London houses began to look like the tombs of an unvisited, unhonoured cemetery of hopes. He had listened. Then, after a silence, he had asked, for he was really young then, "Is there no guidance?" His father was in an unexpectedly soft mood on that night, when the moon swam in a cloudless sky over the begrimed shadows of the town. "You still believe in something, then?" he said, in a clear voice, which had been growing feeble of late. "You believe in flesh and blood, perhaps? A full and equable contempt would soon do away with that too. But since you have not attained to it, I advise you to cultivate that form of contempt which is called pity. It is perhaps the least difficult, always remembering that you, too, if you are anything, are as pitiful as the rest, yet never expecting any pity for yourself." "What is one to do, then?" sighed the young man, regarding his father, rigid in the high-backed chair. "Look on, make no sound," were the last words of the man who had spent his life in blowing blasts upon a terrible trumpet which filled heaven and earth with ruins, while mankind went on its way unheeding. That very night he died in his bed, so quietly that they found him in his usual attitude of sleep, lying on his side, one hand under his cheek, and his knees slightly bent. He had not even straightened his legs. His son buried the silenced destroyer of systems, of hopes, of beliefs. He observed that the death of that bitter contemner of life did not trouble the flow of life's stream, where men and women go by thick as dust, revolving and jostling one another like figures cut out of cork, and weighted with lead just sufficiently to keep them in their proudly upright posture. After the funeral, Haste sat alone in the dusk, and his meditation took the form of a definitive version of the stream, of the fatuously jostling, nodding, spinning figures hurried irresistibly along, and giving no sign of being aware that the voice on the bank had been suddenly silenced. Yes, a few obituary notices generally insignificant, and some grossly abusive. The son had read them all with mournful detachment. "This is the hate and rage of their fear," he thought to himself, "and also of wounded vanity. They shriek their little shriek as they fly past. I suppose I ought to hate him too." He became aware of his eyes being wet. It was not that the man was his father. For him it was purely a matter of hearsay which could not in itself cause this emotion. No, it was because he had looked at him so long that he missed him so much. The dead man had kept him on the bank by his side, and now Haste felt acutely that he was alone on the bank of the stream. In his pride he determined not to enter it. A few slow tears rolled down his face. The rooms, filling with shadows, seemed haunted by a melancholy, uneasy presence which could not express itself. The young man got up with a strange sense of making way for something impalpable that claimed possession, went out of the house, and locked the door. A fortnight later he started on his travels, to look on and never make a sound. The elder Haste had left behind him a little money and a certain quantity of movable objects, such as books, tables, chairs, and pictures, which might have complained of heartless desertion after many years of faithful service. For there is a soul in things. Haste, our Haste, had often thought of them, reproachful and mute, shrouded and locked up in those rooms, far away in London with the sounds of the street reaching them faintly, and sometimes a little sunshine, when the blinds were pulled up and the windows opened from time to time in pursuance of his original instructions and later reminders. It seemed as if in his conception of a world not worth touching, and perhaps not substantial enough to grasp, these objects familiar to his childhood and his youth, and associated with the memory of an old man, were the only realities, something having an absolute existence. He would never have them sold, or even moved from the places they occupied when he looked upon them last. When he was advised from London that his lease had expired, and that the house, with some others as like it as 2 peas, was to be demolished, he was surprisingly distressed. He had entered by then the broad human path of inconsistencies. Already the Tropical Belt Coal Company was in existence. He had sent instructions to have some of the things sent out to him at Samburan, just as any ordinary credulous person would have done. They came, torn out of their long repose, a lot of books, some chairs and tables, his father's portrait in oils, which surprised Haste by its air of youth, because he remembered his father as a much older man. A lot of small objects, such as candlesticks, inkstands, and statuettes from his father's study, which surprised him because they looked so old and so much worn. The manager of the Tropical Belt Coal Company, unpacking them on the veranda in the shade, besieged by a fierce sunshine, must have felt like a remorseful apostate before these relics. He handled them tenderly, and it was perhaps their presence there which attached him to the island when he woke up to the failure of his apostasy. Whatever the decisive reason, Haste had remained where another would have been glad to be off. The excellent Davidson had discovered the fact without discovering the reason, and took a humane interest in Haste's strange existence, while at the same time his native delicacy kept him from intruding on the other's whim of solitude. He could not possibly guess that Haste, alone on the island, felt neither more nor less lonely than in any other place, desert or populous. Davidson's concern was, if one may express it so, the danger of spiritual starvation. But this was a spirit which had renounced all outside nourishment, and was sustaining itself proudly on its own contempt of the usual coarse ailments which life offers to the common appetites of men. Neither was Haste's body in danger of starvation, as Schomberg had so confidently asserted. At the beginning of the company's operations, the island had been provisioned in a manner which had outlasted the need. Haste did not need to fear hunger, and his very loneliness had not been without some alleviation. Of the crowd of imported Chinese labourers, one at least had remained in Samburan, solitary and strange, like a swallow left behind at the migrating season of his tribe. Wang was not a common coolie. He had been a servant to white men before. The agreement between him and Haste consisted in the exchange of a few words on the day when the last batch of the mine coolies was leaving Samburan. Haste, leaning over the balustrade of the veranda, was looking on, as calm in appearance as though he had never departed from the doctrine that this world, for the wise, is nothing but an amusing spectacle. Wang came round the house, and standing below, raised up his yellow, thin face. "All finished?" he asked. Haste nodded slightly from above, glancing towards the jetty. A crowd of blue-clad figures with yellow faces and calves was being hustled down into the boats of the chartered steamer, lying well out, like a painted ship on a painted sea, painted in crude colours, without shadow, without feeling, with brutal precision. "You had better hurry up if you don't want to be left behind." But the Chinaman did not move. "We stop," he declared. Haste looked down at him for the first time. "You want to stop here?" "Yes." "What were you? What was your work here?" "A Muslim boy." "Do you want to stay with me here as my boy?" inquired Haste, surprised. The Chinaman unexpectedly put on a deprecatory expression, and said, after a marked pause, "Can do." "You needn't," said Haste, "unless you like. I propose to stay on here. It may be for a very long time. I have no power to make you go if you wish to remain, but I don't see why you should." "Catch you one pissy wife," remarked Wang unemotionally, and marched off, turning his back on the wharf and the great world beyond, represented by the steamer waiting for her boats. Haste learned presently that Wang had persuaded one of the women of Alfuro village on the west shore of the island, beyond the central ridge, to come over to live with him in a remote part of the company's clearing. It was a curious case, insomuch as the Alfuros, having been frightened by the sudden invasion of Chinamen, had blocked the path over the ridge by felling a few trees, and had kept strictly on their own side. The coolies, as a body, mistrusting the manifest mildness of these harmless fisher folk, had kept to their lines, without attempting to cross the island. Wang was the brilliant exception. He must have been uncommonly fascinating, in a way that was not apparent to Haste, or else uncommonly persuasive. The woman's services to Haste were limited to the fact that she had anchored Wang to the spot by her charms, which remained unknown to the white man, because she never came near the houses. The couple lived at the edge of the forest, and she could sometimes be seen gazing towards the bungalow, shading her eyes with her hand. Even from a distance she appeared to be a shy, wild creature, and Haste, anxious not to try her primitive nerves unduly, scrupulously avoided that side of the clearing in his strolls. The day, or rather the first night after his hermit life began, he was aware of vague sounds of revelry in that direction. Emboldened by the departure of the invading strangers, some Alfuros, the woman's friends and relations, had ventured over the ridge to attend something in the nature of a wedding feast. Wang had invited them, but this was the only occasion when any sound louder than the buzzing of insects had troubled the profound silence of the clearing. The natives were never invited again. Wang not only knew how to live according to conventional proprieties, but had strong personal views as to the manner of arranging his domestic existence. After a time, Haste perceived that Wang had annexed all the keys. Any keys left lying about vanished after Wang had passed that way. Subsequently, some of them, those that did not belong to the storerooms and the empty bungalows, and could not be regarded as the common property of this community of two, were returned to Haste, tied in a bunch with a piece of string. He found them one morning lying by the side of his plate. He had not been inconvenienced by their absence, because they never locked up anything in the way of drawers and boxes. Haste said nothing. Wang also said nothing. Perhaps he had always been a taciturn man. Perhaps he was influenced by the genius of the locality, which was certainly that of silence. Till Haste and Morrison had landed in Black Diamond Bay, and named it, that side of Samburan had hardly ever heard the sound of human speech. It was easy to be taciturn with Haste, who had plunged himself into an abyss of meditation over books, and remained in it till the shadow of Wang falling across the page, and the sound of a rough, low voice uttering the Malay word makan, would force him to climb out to a meal. Wang, in his native province in China, might have been an aggressively, sensitively genial person, but in Samburan he had clothed himself in a mysterious stolidity, and did not seem to resent being spoken to except in single words, at a rate which did not average 6 per day. And he gave no more than he got. It is to be presumed that if he suffered, he made up for it with the Alfuro woman. He always went back to her at the first fall of dusk, vanishing from the bungalow suddenly at this hour, like a sort of topsy-turvy, day-hunting Chinese ghost, with a white jacket and a pigtail. Presently, giving way to a Chinaman's ruling passion, he could be observed breaking the ground near his hut, between the mighty stumps of felled trees, with a miner's pickaxe. After a time he discovered a rusty but serviceable spade in one of the empty storerooms, and it is to be supposed that he got on famously. But nothing of it could be seen, because he went to the trouble of pulling to pieces one of the company's sheds in order to get materials for making a high and very close fence round his patch, as if the growing of vegetables were a patented process, or an awful and holy mystery entrusted to the keeping of his race. Haste, following from a distance the progress of Wang's gardening, and of these precautions there was nothing else to look at, was amused at the thought that he, in his own person, represented the market for its produce. The Chinaman had found several packets of seeds in the storerooms, and had surrendered to an irresistible impulse to put them into the ground. He would make his master pay for the vegetables which he was raising to satisfy his instinct, and, looking silently at the silent Wang going about his work in the bungalow in his hasty, steady way, Haste envied the Chinaman's obedience to his instincts, the powerful simplicity of purpose which made his existence appear almost automatic in the mysterious precision of its facts.